Joining us now from Oakland University's School of Business Administration is Assistant Professor of Management Michael Greiner on today's edition of the Megacast for a weekly talk about the markets and the economy. Michael, thanks for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me, and thanks for accommodating my schedule this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Always glad to have you on with us as we're talking about the economy and one of the big impacts on the U.S. economy and therefore on the Michigan economy in the past year and some change has been Russia's invasion and the continuing war with Ukraine. As we're a year out from when that conflict turned hot and became a full-fledged war between Russia and Ukraine, just how much of an impact has that had on the U.S. economy?
Well, it's had a huge impact on the U.S. economy and truly the global economy. Ironically, in some respects, it's actually benefited the U.S. economy. I mean, there are some things that have been very positive for us that have come from it. For example, we have been able to increase our oil exports and gas exports to Europe. And the United States now is actually the largest exporter of energy in the world. And we are a net exporter by a pretty substantial margin. And that has to do a lot with the fact that Europe has basically shifted over from importing oil and gas from Russia over to importing it from the United States. So that's been a positive development for the United States here. It also has led to increases in cybersecurity, which, of course, we're all concerned about the potential for different entities to be able to break into our computer infrastructure, our internet infrastructure, and disrupt things as important as energy, which certainly here in Michigan we're well aware of the impact that can have after the storms last week. But as a result of this invasion, literally our cybersecurity awareness and protection has dramatically increased around the globe. And finally, what's more is, you hate to put it this way, but war is inevitably a generator of income and jobs in some ways. Yes, within Ukraine, it's obviously been incredibly destructive, and their economy has declined by, I think, about 35%. But here in the United States, obviously, what we're doing now is we're spending more money to build weapons that are able to go and replace the ones that are being used up in Ukraine at a very fast rate. Ironically, that's part of the reason why Russia's economy has done relatively well compared to what many people expected. And it's been the big increase in spending on the war effort by the Russian government. Ironically, the Russian government is in kind of a tough spot when it comes to that because of the sanctions that the United States has imposed upon it. They don't have access to about $300 billion of reserves that they had basically piled up in the Federal Reserve and in other central banks in the West. And they've also defaulted on their bonds, which means that they're pretty much unable to go to the world to borrow the money. At this point, they're relying on some gold reserves they have, as well as some money that they have in the Chinese yuan, which they've been able to reserve. But the truth of the matter is, they're kind of in a tough spot because they actually have, at this point, a larger budget deficit by far than the United States has. And unlike the United States, they're unable to go to the global markets to finance that. So while it feels like the Russian economy is doing better than some might have thought, a lot of that is borne up by military spending. And similarly, you're seeing also increases in military spending in Western Europe as well. So, for example, in Germany and in the UK and in France, they're talking about spending more on the militaries, which, again, that's also something that pumps money into the economy. So the irony is, although there have been certainly some hardships that have been felt around the world, for the United States itself, the war in Ukraine has actually been, to some respects, an economic positive.
And as we talk about the positives in the economy, the overarching negative has been inflation, and it's really had quite a lot of staying power, even though it's been reduced over time. It's not quite having as major of an impact as it had 6 months ago, 8 months ago, a year ago. But it's still continuing to have an impact, and as the Federal Reserve continues its response to that, raising interest rates, albeit at a slower rate, how much of that staying power is really continuing to be problematic in our U.S. economy, and that therefore trickling down, and we're seeing those prices still remain relatively high here in Michigan?
Yeah, you're right. And actually, we received some pretty discouraging news last Friday, where the personal consumption expenditures index, that number was released and actually showed a slight increase from the month before. And that's not something that we want to see. Frankly, it was something that we were concerned about. And I think we talked about probably last week on the show, where we'd had some very strong employment numbers. And it appears that especially the place that you're seeing the strength of the jobs market is in the services industry, where obviously you end up having higher costs of labor because a lot of what you're providing in the service industries is the labor itself. There's no goods that are being turned into something else. So the impact of increases in labor costs there are very strong. And it appears then that this increase in costs in the services sector then is boiling over into the rest of the economy, and that is really slowing down the efforts to fight inflation. Now, what does this mean as far as the Fed is concerned? You're right about the fact that they've been slowing down on their increases on interest rates. And part of the reason they've been slowing it down is the places that interest rates have the biggest impact, things like the housing market, especially, but also for vehicles and for investments by businesses, especially the housing market. That industry is basically in a severe recession right now, and you can see that in housing starts, you can see that in new home sales, you can see that in used home sales, and that's largely because of the fact that interest rates on mortgages, as a result of interest rates generally being high, interest rates on mortgages then are very high. So people can't afford to kind of buy the kind of house that they at one point were able to. So there was a sense that the increases in the interest rate were starting to have effect. But if the shift in inflation then is going over to the services sector, unfortunately, it probably means that more is going to have to be done. So unless we see some change with some new figures in the next couple weeks, I would not be surprised if at their next meeting on March 15th and 16th, we actually see the Fed increase the rate by which they're increasing the interest rates. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see a 0.5% increase. And unless things get better, I'm sure that they'll be talking about the potential of an even bigger increase like we'd seen in the past.
And we're not seeing inflation, therefore, run these prices up for goods and for services so significantly higher as we'd seen initially, as this was hitting a little bit under a year ago. And these strategies in some cases have been working, but what are those contributing factors that really continue to push inflation to be at the level of power it still is at over our economy? Is it the job market? Is it the fact that those that would typically be working at this time are not filling those jobs, or those dynamics between prospective employers and those employees that are looking for jobs, and really those employees, because there's so many jobs to fill, having an upper hand? What are the contributing factors that still make inflation so powerful?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tyler. And really, this has been the strangest period economically. And I think that for years, economists are going to be looking back and studying it because it's been one crisis after another. I mean, obviously, we initially had the COVID recession, and then the bounce back from that recession meant that there was this incredible acceleration in economic activity, which then is really what set off inflation. Then you had the invasion in Ukraine, which drove up the prices of energy in particular, but also on the global markets, there were big increases in the cost of some food items. For example, Ukraine and Russia are major producers of wheat, and Ukraine in particular is a major producer of certain kinds of vegetable oil. And the impact of that has been felt not so much here in the United States, but in many of the third world countries, especially in Africa. The impact has been enormous, where you're starting to deal with major famines in some of these countries. But that then kind of trickles down into the United States, where certain food products end up being sold for higher than they would have otherwise, because the fact that many of these prices are set on the global market. Then you had a bunch of little things happen, like for example, there was the shortage with semiconductors as a result of the kind of the reopening of the economy and how it kind of happened in fits and starts. Well, that unavailable of semiconductors, which of course are the chips that we have in computers, but not just in computers, but also in cars and refrigerators and appliances, just about everything now. And that then led to problems where businesses weren't able to produce the amount of goods that people were demanding. Well, we've pretty much dealt with that. Now, the latest issue that we have that's kind of unbelievable is that the people have talked about the increase in prices of eggs. Well, the reason for that is apparently there's a big problem with bird flu, and so they've had to kill off many of the chickens, and as a result of that, there's a shortage in eggs, and it's just one thing after another after another. But I'd say the biggest factor that has we've really seen consistently throughout this, and you really put your finger on this, Tyler, is the labor market. And it has to do with the fact that as a result of the COVID recession, you saw a couple things happen. Number one, you saw where immigration slowed pretty dramatically, and we rely here in the United States on a large immigration workforce, essentially supporting our economy. And although there's been an increase in immigration over the past year or so, that has really not been enough to make up for the loss in immigration that we had as a result of the COVID recession. Then, secondly, you've seen a whole group of people who've decided, hey, I don't want to go back to work after this. Especially, we're dealing with the aging of the baby boomers now, many of whom are 65 or older, and a lot of them are saying, it's time for me to retire. It's time for me to spend time with my grandchildren. I don't want to spend my time working anymore. And for the most part, this is a generation that's relatively wealthy, that has good savings, and with them now qualifying for Social Security, many of them having paid off their homes, they're in a good position to be able to retire. And so that has led to this shortage of employees, which then leads to this bidding up of the cost for employees for the few remaining ones who are still out there. And again, the impact of that is especially hard felt in the service sector. Now, right now, the latest figures show that there's still about 2 jobs available for every person who's looking for work. So what that means is if employers want to get the people to come for them, it's the old supply and demand curve that we all know from Econ 101. Well, what that curve says is that then the cost of those few remaining employees is going to go up. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the labor market. And if there's any single thing that has probably had the biggest impact on the long-term inflation, that's probably it.
We're joined by Michael Greiner from Oakland University's School of Business Administration, where he is an assistant professor of management. On today's edition of the Megacast, you can keep up to date with all of Oakland University's programs in their School of Business Administration and across the university at oakland.edu. Oakland.edu for more information. And as we're talking about the impact of inflation and combating inflation in particular from the federal government, what, if anything, is being done or can be done at the statewide level to reduce the impact of inflation right here in Michigan? Is there anything that can be done from that secondary level really to combat the overall impact of the national and the world economy on Michigan?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough situation. And it has to go back to the fact that really, we're part of a federated country in a lot of ways. And in some respects, Michigan actually does better than a lot of states in that regard, because we are a net producer of income for the country, a net producer of revenues. We send more taxes to the federal government than we get back, which some people might view as a negative. But the reality is, because we've got such a strong economy here in Michigan and such a well-educated workforce, a manufacturing-based economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I don't need to hit on all those strengths that we have. When you compare how we're doing compared to, say, some poorer states like, say, Mississippi, or the best example would be Puerto Rico, where they literally have been dealing with a major league recession and inability to pay its bonds, largely because of the fact that, again, their economy is run on dollars, and the value of the dollar is set by the most prosperous parts of the economy. And the more prosperous parts of the economy, of course, are places like here in Michigan, California, New York, places like that. We saw a similar situation, for example, in Europe, where a lot of people like to point to, say, Greece. We all heard about the crisis that Greece had with its with paying its bonds. But it wasn't just Greece. It was also Italy. It was also Spain. It was also Portugal. Although, and for that matter, even uh, I'm blanking out here. Excuse me. I'm just some of the countries, but so many of these countries in Europe end up having problems. Well, again, that's because of the fact that you have some real economic powerhouses, namely Germany and France to a slightly lesser extent, and also Poland for that matter, who've been so successful that they drive up the value of the euro. And that then makes it more difficult for these parts of Europe that are less economically successful to be able to manage their debts. So that's exactly what you see here in the United States. So actually, ironically, here in Michigan, we're doing pretty well overall. There is some talk by the administration in Lansing of trying to do some tax givebacks and that type of thing. That can certainly be helpful. Put some money back into people's pockets. But really, overall, we should be feeling very blessed here in Michigan that we do have such a strong economy and such a resilient economy, because it's the type of thing that has put us in better shape, frankly, than a lot of other states in the country.
Yeah, somehow, some way, the state of Michigan in recent years been able to multiple times operate
Yeah.
in a surplus as compared to certainly the U.S. government, but many of our other
Yeah.
states as well.
For sure. Yeah. No, we're doing very well here in Michigan compared to a lot of states. It's something that I think all of us Michiganians, we should really give ourselves a pat on the back for.
Absolutely. Michael, a couple more minutes with you before we'll need to say goodbye today. Anything else at this time that is making news on the economic level or in the markets that would be important for our audience to keep in mind and keep in consideration over the next week before we speak next?
Sure. Well, one thing that's interesting that's happening is actually today, the United States Supreme Court is hearing arguments on the effort by the president to forgive some student loans. That's an issue that we've talked about in the past here. And basically, what you have is you have two lawsuits. One coming from, I believe, Texas, where you have some individuals who say that they're suing because of the fact that basically they were not eligible to get the relief from student loans under the plan that was proposed by the Biden administration. And then a separate one, I believe, coming from Missouri, where you have a couple of states, particularly the state of Missouri, who are claiming that they were harmed by this plan because of the fact that they had essentially set up a servicer for student loans. Anybody who pays student loans might be familiar with this. It's called MOHELA, and it's an organization that was set up by the state of Missouri to be able to process student loans, and they process them across the country. And the theory is that because of the fact that certain student loans would be forgiven, that MOHELA would be processing less student loans and would get less revenue as a result of them. And that somehow that would harm the state of Missouri. Well, the big issue in these cases, frankly, is a legal concept called standing, which is that courts don't like to consider theoretical issues. They don't want to know, they don't want to talk about, oh, this is something that I feel badly about. What they want to do is they want to look at actual cases and controversies, things where someone actually is hurt by an action and where there's actually something the court can do to try to resolve it. Well, in this case, the argument is on pretty thin ground, frankly, that either of these parties have been actually hurt by the proposal from this administration. For example, people saying that, hey, I can't get relief from this proposal by the Biden administration. Well, they couldn't get relief before either. So how does the proposal from the Biden administration somehow change that? Similarly, in the case of the states that are suing, MOHELA has been spun off. It's a separate entity at this point. And in fact, there are documents that show from MOHELA that that they basically don't have any kind of contractual relationship with the state of Missouri. So it's a tough road to hoe for the states and these individuals to prove that they have standing, that they've somehow been harmed by this action that gives them the right to be able to sue in our system. Frankly, that's going to be the hardest thing for them to overcome because unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon your perspective, I guess, if they do get through the standing issue, I would say that the Biden administration does have a problem with this. The biggest problem being that their basis to forgive the student loans had to do with the COVID pandemic. that essentially, because of the fact that people's incomes went down during the COVID pandemic, we may recall, starting during the Trump administration, actually, there were efforts to essentially stay the requirement that you make payments and stay any interest that was owed. And anybody who owes student loans knows that you haven't had to make payments on student loans literally since the pandemic hit. Well, the argument is that under that same legal authority, the Biden administration believes that it can forgive some of the student loans. The problem that they're going to be dealing with here, though, is that they've already announced that all the efforts that are related to resolving the pandemic, all the emergency steps that are being taken, will expire in May. So how can they justify that they're going to be able to forgive these student loans, which really won't happen probably until June or so, when all the emergency measures associated with the pandemic expire in May? Kind of a tough argument for them to make, and frankly, I think the Supreme Court would be open to that. But again, the tough burden that the states and the individuals are going to have to get over, though, is this question of standing. And if I were a betting man, I'd say that they aren't going to be able to get across it. But unfortunately, people who bet on the Supreme Court are quick to lose their money in these days.
Well, Michael, we appreciate you giving us your insight and your information and knowledge on these different issues, all of which are going to affect our economy here in Michigan in a variety of different ways. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Tyler. I'll see you next week.